Good afternoon. Good morning to those on the West Coast. This is Tom Davis. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on the rental assistance demonstration. Just for folks' awareness, the webinar is being recorded, including any questions at the end of the webinar, so be aware that it is being recorded. We are also planning to put the recording on the RAD resource desk. The slides that we're presenting today will also be available on the RAD resource desk. It will take a couple days for the recording and the slides to show up on the RAD resource desk, but folks who are on the line can also download the slides. There's a download a handout option, which are the slides that we are going through. So if you want the slides immediately, feel free to download them from the webinar. Glad you're all here, and thank you very much for calling in. As I said, this is a webinar on the rental assistance demonstration, and specifically we're talking today about the resident protections and engagement in public housing conversions. This is a crucially important topic, given that the residents is why we're all doing what we are all variously doing. And I know that I hope that there are some residents on the line, as well as folks who work with residents and help residents understand this process, because the more information that we can get out to the resident community, the better this process goes. The resident involvement, resident awareness, and resident rights is a key requirement and a key component of the design of the RAD program. We're very pleased that the RAD program has a robust package of resident rights and resident consultation and resident notice requirements. And so we very much want all of you to be familiar with those and aware of those. This webinar is also trying to sketch out a little bit of how the RAD process works from the resident point of view, so that you can have some awareness of the process and what to expect. Certainly, RAD conversions that involve construction can be, a lot of change and stressful for folks, and so a lot of the resident protections and resident rights and resident consultation requirements are designed to mitigate and reduce the impact of that stress. It's not possible to completely eliminate the stress of living through a renovation at a property, but we very much want to ensure that the residents know what's going on and have as smooth a time of it as possible. With me today are two folks who will be doing most of the presentation. One is Will Levy with our Program Administration Office, and the other is Tyee Alex, who is a relatively newer member of the Program Administration Office. And Will and Tyee will be taking us through the various resident protections and engagement and the process around RAD conversions from the resident interaction side of things. So with that, one or two last logistical items. We are going to hold the questions till the end so that we make sure that we get through the base presentation, but we will take questions, and if there are any questions that we don't get to, we'll try to get back to the questioner. And as always, whether now or later, folks can ask questions that we will respond to you directly by sending an email to rad@hud.gov, and I will remind folks of that at the end of the webinar. But now, turn it over to Will.
Thanks, Tom. So before we dive into the resident engagement and rights requirements, I want to first provide a brief background on RAD, why it was developed, what it is, and key principles in its design. Let's go on to the next slide. So first of all, why RAD? So in 2010, the nation's public housing inventory was estimated to have a $26 billion capital repair and replacement need backlog. Many folks think that number is even higher today, in the 30 or 40 or $50 billion range. But we have a crisis on our hands, an ongoing crisis on our hands, where we have a large, critical, affordable inventory that is deteriorating. Most properties are over 50 years old, which by most real estate is beyond its quote unquote useful life. Public housing properties are almost completely reliant on funding from Congress through the Public Housing Operating Fund and Capital Fund to sustain existing housing. And sometimes those appropriation levels are just inadequate to maintain the housing. So RAD was created in 2011 to preserve and bring new resources to this critical stock of affordable housing by converting properties to subsidy under a long-term project-based Section 8 contract. That's a big term, long-term project-based Section 8 contract. Under a project-based Section 8 contract, the rental assistance is tied to the property. Tenants pay 30% of adjusted income in rent, and HUD pays the difference between what's called the contract rent and the tenant's rent, that 30% of income. RAD is implemented, on the next page, we show RAD is implemented through a HUD notice. The RAD notice, as we call it, covers the conversion of public housing properties, but also has separate sections for the conversion of other forms of assisted housing, including the 202 pracs, mod rehab, and rents up and wrap. We'll actually be covering the resident rights on what we call the second component of RAD, covering these conversion options next week. But today's presentation will be focused on public housing. The RAD notice describes the requirements a public housing authority must satisfy in order to convert a property either to project-based rental assistance or project-based vouchers, the two forms of long-term Section 8 contracts. When a property converts, it's no longer subject to public housing regulations, but as we will describe in this webinar, the properties will be subject to Section 8 requirements that ensure the property's ongoing affordability and protect resident rights. The RAD notice, recently updated on September 5th. This webinar will overview both the pre-existing requirements as well as the new requirements that were outlined in a recent update to the RAD notice. We should also mention that in addition to the RAD notice, HUD also has a separate notice that deals exclusively with civil rights and relocation, obviously also important to the resident experience. Together, these notices provide the rules for RAD. Let's go on to the next slide. At its heart, when we talk about conversion, we're talking about changing the form of federal assistance that is provided to a property. The primary benefit of a conversion is that it stabilizes the revenue available to maintain the properties in decent, safe, and sanitary condition. In the example on this chart, we show the funding for a property in the public housing program in peach. Note how it fluctuates from year to year. And then compare that with the funding available for the property following a conversion to Section 8. The initial funding following the conversion is based on public housing levels, but then inflates each year at a steady rate. And also, very importantly, it comes from a federal subsidy source, the Section 8 accounts, that are proven to be much more dependable. Slide. So how do public housing agencies use RAD? Well, primarily, they use it to stabilize funding for properties, as we just discussed. And then that leads to an ability to finance repairs and improvements, sometimes even demolish properties and replace the housing, one for one. And in some cases, PHAs transfer the assistance to new properties in lower poverty neighborhoods with access to schools, jobs, and transportation. To achieve these goals, PHAs often seek outside funding sources, outside financing sources, most commonly debt, commercially available debt that's used in just about every other form of affordable housing except for public housing. They use low-income housing tax credits. PHAs can use public housing funds. And then PHAs can secure other grants or soft loans, such as home or CDBG. Moving on to slide 8. In addition, clearly, to RAD having a clear goal of facilitating property improvements, RAD was designed with core principles to guarantee broader public benefit, including long-term affordability, mission-based stewardship, and the maintenance and strengthening of resident rights. So let's go through each of those. The first core principle, RAD is designed to secure the long-term affordability of converting properties. How do we do this? When a property converts, it's put under a long-term, 20-year Section 8 contract, and that contract ensures that residents pay an affordable rent. And very importantly, that contract is required to renew at the end of that 20 years for another 20 years. And then at the end of that term, renews again and again and again and again. So the renewal occurs in perpetuity to ensure the property remains affordable. To further secure HUD's position in the property, we require a RAD use agreement that's recorded on the land and that is superior to any other liens that are placed in the land. Before a property converts, we require that it undertake a capital needs assessment upfront to ensure that the owner, the PHA and owner, can address current and future repairs. And then finally, we require the one-for-one replacement of deeply affordable units. So we permit certain minor exceptions. For example, we allow reduction of up to 5% of units in some cases, or for long-term vacant units that have been vacant for over 24 months. These exceptions are rarely used, so program-wide we have a very strong record of replacing nearly every single public housing unit that's converted. The second core principle, properties converted under RAD must be owned or controlled by a public or nonprofit owner. So in the vast majority of RAD conversions, the PHA continues to own the property directly or through an affiliate. But when low-income housing tax credits are used, that's about 30 to 40% of the time, ownership changes technically into a new entity, but that new entity must be controlled by a public or nonprofit. And therefore, a public or nonprofit has to have an ongoing role at the property, regardless of financing. Next core principle, that ensures that current residents benefit from the conversion. As properties are improved and preserved through RAD, it's critical to make sure that the current public housing residents will benefit from any improvements in property conditions. So to that effect, to that end, there are resident meetings and notices required to make sure residents are informed and know their rights. All residents have a right to remain in or return to the property in case they have to be temporarily relocated. Residents cannot be rescreened as a result of RAD. And RAD requires relocation assistance consistent with the Uniform Relocation Act, if relocation is needed. And the last core principle here, RAD retains and strengthens resident rights. There's an ongoing right to organize and resident participation funding. We carry over public housing procedural rights, including grievance and termination procedures. And we introduce a new right called choice mobility, where a resident could, after living in the property for some period, request a tenant-based voucher if they wish to move. We'll go over these rights in greater detail later in this webinar, but this is just a high-level overview. Okay, moving on to slide 12. Let's now provide an overview of the steps PHAs need to take to convert a public housing property through RAD. And we'll have a special emphasis on resident engagement and related resident items in that process. This next slide, slide 13, reflects the major milestones in a RAD conversion. The first thing HUD receives from a PHA is the RAD application. Typically, PHAs take 1 to 2 months to prepare that application because it requires some on-the-ground work with residents and their board. HUD reviews that application typically within 60 days and issues a CHAP. It's called Commitment to Enter into a HAP Contract. It's a conditional award, an initial award. And then PHAs spend the next 6 to 18 months developing and submitting a financing plan where they fully describe their conversion plan. Before they submit that financing plan, we require that they have a concept call with HUD to identify, to discuss their project plans and for us to assess whether the PHA is ready to submit their financing plan. Once they submit their financing plan, typically within 60 to 90 days, we review and approve or require changes to the financing plan, the approval is done through a document called the RAD Conversion Commitment, or the RCC. The PHA then typically takes 60 to 90 days to complete the conversion. Once converted and under a Section 8 contract, any work that may be required at the property would begin. So far, over 120,000 public housing units across more than 1,100 properties have completed this entire process. We have roughly another 140,000 units somewhere in our pipeline. Congress has authorized HUD to convert 455,000 units in total. And so between what we've closed and what's in the pipeline, we have over 150,000 units in space for new housing authorities to participate in RAD. Okay, let's go through each of these steps in greater detail. So first on the RAD application, in the RAD application, a PHA expresses their intention to HUD to convert under RAD. They provide basic preliminary project plans that often end up needing to change or get adapted and modified along the way. Before they submit their application, the PHA secures board approval. Similarly, on the resident engagement side, before submitting the application, the PHA must provide a notice to residents called the RAD information notice, which provides residents general conversion plans and an overview of resident rights. And they must conduct at least 2 meetings with property residents and the resident council. The PHA then submits to HUD with their application a summary of resident comments and the PHA's responses to those comments within the RAD application. Let's move on to the next step, CHAP award. So after HUD reviews and approves an application, we issue a CHAP. The CHAP serves to reserve the PHA's ability to convert. Once the CHAP is issued, that's when the PHA begins to identify the necessary scope of work that the property may need, finds partners, again, if needed, and secures financing commitments, among other due diligence. We're doing a bunch of work with residents at this point. All residents in the property at the time of CHAP have a right to remain. So the PHA starts to maintain a resident log to make sure that it can track residents, all those residents at time of CHAP, all the way through closing, and if there's work to be done, any relocation through all that period. So this is where they're beginning. The PHA issues a general information notice. This is a URA notice, a Uniform Relocation Act required notice, which provides general information on relocation benefits in the event the resident may need to be relocated. Residents should not view the GIN as a need to move at that point. It's not. It does not do that. If a resident will need to move temporarily to facilitate construction or rehab, they'll get more detailed information later on in the process. Also during this stage between the CHAP and the financing plan, the PHA is initiating the public process to amend their PHA plan. So a lot of their work is done with residents of the property. This is a step where they're informing the broader community of their intention to convert and some of the contours of their conversion plan. The PHA is also conducting at least one more resident meeting before the concept call. And more meetings would be required if their plans change from how they originally presented them to residents, or if the PHA requires extensions from HUD. Especially in more complex conversions, PHAs are highly encouraged to maintain routine communication with residents to provide updates on plans. Typically, especially now with changes in the RAD notice, more complex conversions will require more than one meeting because the PHA will need more time to prepare their financing plan. Continuing on to the concept call and financing plan. So as it is, once it's identified its scope of work and secured financing commitments and performed other due diligence, it'll request a concept call with HUD to discuss its firmer plans and demonstrate that it's ready. PHA will then submit, if we determine that the PHA is ready to submit its financing plan, within a month or two, the PHA will then submit to us the capital needs assessment, environmental review, proposed financing, and other items. Between the concept call and the financing plan, the PHA has to conduct another meeting with the residents to provide the residents with the firmer project plans. within the financing plan, the PHA is providing a summary of resident comments and the PHA's response to those comments. Generally, around this time, PHAs will also be having more individualized discussions with residents about their relocation, if relocation is needed, about their relocation options and where they might go and for what period. Moving on to the RCC. So after the PHA submitted its financing plan, if it's approvable, HUD issues the RAD conversion commitment, which approves the financing plan. The RCC lists closing requirements and any required work that must be completed after closing. And the PHA begins to prepare its closing package. The PHA at this point is providing additional notices to residents, including information about the timing of conversion, the new form of lease, the duration of work, and the new property owner. Temporary relocation may begin once the RCC is issued, as long as the PHA has provided appropriate relocation notices by this time, either a 30-day or a 90-day notice, depending on the period of relocation. When we move on to closing. Closing is when the PHA has completed all of the conversion requirements. At that point, they'll sign a new Section 8 HAB contract. They'll record the new RAD use agreement on the land. We'll release the declaration of trust, the public housing declaration of trust from the land, and we'll remove the public housing units from public housing funding. At this point, residents will sign new Section 8 leases. Public housing lease would be terminated. New tenant certifications are not needed at this point. Owners will just carry over the prior public housing certification. And at this point, PHAs are not to report any outstanding tenant debt into the Earned Income Verification Debts Owed module as a result of the conversion. If there are justifiable reasons to enter debt in prior to conversion, they should do so. But conversion itself and what's called the 50058 end of participation is not cause to report tenant debt into the EIV Debts Owed module. Once closing has been completed, typically that's when any construction or rehab would occur. Lots of properties don't undergo any construction rehab, so this step doesn't always occur, but most do, or have some level of construction or rehabilitation. It would be outlined in the RCC with precise scope of work. Once they've completed that rehab or construction, the PHA owner then provides the completion certification to HUD to show us that the work's been done and that residents have moved back. And of course, during this time, residents may be living in temporary relocation during the rehab or construction period. Residents then would return following that period. The PHA should be maintaining communication with residents throughout and providing notice when residents are able to return to the property. When all residents have returned, the PHA will be able to finalize its resident log, which tracks residents all the way from CHAP to return to the property. So that's an overview of the procedural steps of a RAD conversion and the resident touch points. I'll now turn to Tai to talk through the specific resident rights that have been baked into RAD's design.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Will, for that, and Tom for the overview. As Will mentioned, this portion of the webinar will focus on the individual resident rights included in the RAD notice, which apply to all residents living in public housing that is converting to Section 8 through RAD. Resident rights are very important in the RAD process and are designed to maintain and expand on existing public housing rights. All residents should be informed about what their rights are, and all PHAs involved in RAD should stay in regular communication with residents about the process. This overview is designed to highlight the most critical components of RAD conversions that intersect with resident rights. The right to remain and right of return. Most conversions do not involve relocation, which means that residents will remain in their homes. However, if it is necessary, one of the most essential resident rights in RAD is the right to remain and the right to return, which means that any person who is legally on the lease or otherwise in lawful occupancy at the converting property has a right to remain in, or if there will be rehabilitation of the property that will result in the relocation of residents, a right to return to an assisted unit at the property. A note that the resident will return to an assisted, properly sized unit, but it may not be the original unit in which they previously resided. Just to reiterate, no resident may be permanently involuntarily displaced. No rescreening. Residents cannot be rescreened following a RAD conversion. This includes income, criminal background, and credit screening. After the conversion, residents will be covered by all Section 8 residency requirements. A conversion under RAD cannot be the basis for an eviction or loss of rental assistance. Relocation. As Will previously mentioned, relocation in RAD conversions is not common. If relocation is necessary in order for repairs to be completed at the project, a resident may need to be relocated to temporary housing. Relocation cannot begin until HUD approves the financing plan and issues the RAD conversion commitment, or RCC. Before a PHA can proceed with relocation plans, they must provide residents with a general information notice, as Will recently mentioned, which must include an overview of resident rights under the RAD notice and the URA, and information regarding a resident's right to return, relocation assistance, and displacement. If a resident will be relocated, they must be notified at least 90 days in advance. The temporary housing must be affordable, decent, safe, and sanitary. Residents must be reimbursed for out-of-pocket expenses incurred during relocation, including moving expenses, increased housing costs, and meals if the unit does not have cooking facilities. If the relocation extends beyond 12 months, the resident is considered displaced for the purposes of URA protection, and this includes permanent relocation assistance. Finally, PHAs must maintain a resident log for all impacted residents, which must be provided to HUD upon request. Alternative housing options. While residents have the right to return to a converted property post-rehab, PHAs may also offer alternative housing options, which ensure that residents remain in affordable housing best suited for their household. Examples of this could include vouchers, other public housing, other converted RAD properties, homeownership opportunities. In the event that residents voluntarily decline their right to return, the PHA must obtain written consent, which is 1, informed through written notification and the provision of counseling, 2, voluntary, which requires that the resident is not pressured to make a decision and has at least 30 days to do so, and 3, documented. This means that the PHA is required to retain evidence that the resident was informed in writing, received counseling, and communicated their final decision. Right of return and low-income housing tax credits. LIHTC cannot bar the right of return. As Will described earlier, one of the funding sources used by PHAs to support rehab or construction costs is the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. While this program has different income requirements than Section 8, residents cannot be barred from returning to the property following a conversion. Residents residing in properties that receive low-income tax credits will be screened for eligibility during the RAD conversion process. This will not impact their right to return or their eligibility to reside in affordable housing. Income eligibility for LIHTC is generally 60% of area median income, though can be higher for states that have adopted what is known as income averaging, which allows some residents to have higher income if, on the whole, the property is serving very low-income households. Post-conversion resident rents. Resident rents remain affordable after conversion, and most rents will not change at all. In Section 8, residents pay 30% of their adjusted gross income. If a public housing resident is paying a flat rent at the time of the RAD conversion, their rent will instead be calculated as 30% of their income. If the rent will increase by more than the greater of 10% or $25 per month, the increase will be phased in over 3 or 5 years. Residents must be provided notice of the rent phase-in prior to the conversion. Residency self-sufficiency program. Most of the resources and services available through resident self-sufficiency programs will continue to be available to residents following a RAD conversion. So this includes FSS, will continue to at least through the current grant period, and in many cases can be renewed for ongoing participation. ROS will only continue through the current grant period and will not be available for renewal. EID, currently enrolled residents can continue to participate, but new residents cannot be enrolled. For Jobs Plus, residents enrolled in the EID component of Jobs Plus will continue to be eligible post-conversion. All residents can continue to utilize services created as a result of the program. Section 3 in RAD. The Section 3 program requires that recipients of certain HUD financial assistance provide training, employment, contracting, and other economic opportunities to low and very low-income people, especially recipients of government assistance for housing, and to businesses that provide economic opportunities for low and very low-income persons. So in the case of RAD, any rehab or construction performed as a part of RAD conversion is subject to Section 3, as it relates to low-income hiring and contracting requirements. PHAs must take proactive steps in their hiring and the awarding of contracts to businesses that are owned by or substantially employ those persons. And there has to be a preference for hiring opportunities provided to public housing and Section 8 residents. Resident procedural rights. Resident procedural rights are governed by the RAD notice, and in the case of multifamily Section 8 properties, 24 CFR Part 245. A note that these rights shift from 24 CFR Part 964, which only apply to public housing. However, the procedural rights included in the RAD notice in 245 are intentionally robust and comprehensive. They include a resident's right to organize, form resident organizations, canvass, meet on the property, receive resident participation funding, and access to grievance and termination procedures consistent with public housing requirements. A note that the grievance and termination procedures must be incorporated into the resident lease. In order to be considered a resident organization, it must be established by the residents of the property, meet regularly, operate democratically, represent all residents of the property, and be independent from the property owner. Resident participation funds are also available to RAD residents. This includes $25 per occupied unit per year, with at least $15 of this amount going directly to resident participation activities, which can include resident education, organizing around tenancy issues, and training activities. The owner can use up to $10 of this to pay for costs to administer resident participation activities. Choice mobility. Following a conversion, residents may request a tenant-based voucher after a period of residency at the converted property. Choice mobility is a new right available to residents in RAD properties, which allows residents to elect to move at a later date with a tenant-based voucher if, for example, they need to move for a job, be closer to a sick family member, or any other number of reasons. This is a major new right that residents would gain that is not available in the public housing program. It is voluntary and serves as an option for a resident. It's never a requirement. A voucher allows a resident the option to rent a unit in the private market with HUD assistance. If the rent for the unit is reasonable and an inspection of the unit shows that the unit meets HUD's housing quality standards, the PHA can approve the unit. If approved, the resident will sign a lease with the owner and pay about 30% of their income for rent. The PHA signs a contract with the owner to pay the difference between the rent the resident pays and the total rent for the unit. Prior to closing, the PHA must provide information to the residents about the choice mobility option, which includes an overview of opportunities and procedures. For project-based voucher properties, residents may request a housing choice voucher after 1 year of residency at the converted property. For project-based rental assistance properties, residents may request a housing choice voucher after 2 years of residency. A note that a small number of PBRA properties do not have access to a voucher program, and in that case would have a good cause exemption from the choice mobility component of RAD. Additionally, for PBRA conversions, the owner and PHA must maintain a separate agreement describing implementation of the choice mobility program, which can include the adoption of additional limitations. The choice mobility option, if applicable, must be included in the lease. RAD and non-RAD project-based vouchers. We sometimes see that PHAs utilize a RAD conversion along with local project-based vouchers, which help to increase the funding available to the property and support greater improvements. In such cases, we have recently modified the RAD notice to ensure that the robust RAD rights will extend to all residents in the property, including residents living in the non-RAD PBV units. These include no rescreening, right of return, rent phase-in, family self-sufficiency programs, resident participation rights and funding, grievance and termination procedural rights, and choice mobility. A few reminders for residents. Residents should always check notices for information about the RAD process. Attend all meetings when possible, and if not, find a time to meet with the property manager when you are able to obtain all information that was presented at the meeting. Ask questions and be proactive. Seek clarification or more information if needed before signing anything. Residents are likely and encouraged to have questions come up along the way, and periodically issues may arise. The first step should always be with your property manager. If your property has not yet converted and you need further assistance, you can contact your local PIH HUD field office. We've provided a link on this slide with information, with contact information. If the property has converted, confirm whether the property has converted to either PBRA or PBV. This should be on your lease. If PBRA, contact the multifamily regional office. We also provided a link on this slide for that contact information. If PBV, it will be the HUD Public Housing Field Office. When you contact HUD, remember to include all information you have about the property, the name, location, PHA or owner, conversion type, time frame, and your issues, concerns, or questions.
Great. So thank you, Tai. Thank you, Will. We've tried to design this presentation to leave some time for questions from all of you so that we can speak to what you're most interested in. There are a couple ways of submitting questions. You can submit questions through the webinar process, through the webinar program by writing the question and submitting it, or you can raise your hand when we see a raised hand, we will unmute your phone. You can then ask the question, and then we'll try to answer it. We may not be able to get through all of the questions today, but we will, if there are questions that we don't get to that are written questions, we will get back to you in writing. And if you were going to raise your hand and ask a question and we don't get to you, certainly feel free to send an email to rad@hud.gov, and then we will get the questions back to you at that point. So the first question is a question that was submitted in writing where someone asked, are families considered in place at the time the CHAP is issued or at the time the RCC is issued? And I assume this question is about in place for purposes of the RAD right of return. So as Tayi mentioned, the RAD right of return applies to anybody who is legally in occupancy, and that is actually, it's definitely at the time of the CHAP. What I'm trying to remember is whether it's actually at the time the application is submitted, which might be, and Tayi is nodding her head yes. So it's at the time of the application being submitted. So it is before the RCC and before the CHAP. So really the folks who are entitled to the right of return are all of the folks who were living at the property when the housing authority starts the RAD process. And we measure starting the RAD process from when the application is submitted to HUD. So we are trying to make sure that the right of return is as expansive as possible. It does mean that if someone moves in after the application has been submitted, they also benefit from the right of return. You don't have to have been there right from the date of application all the way through. It's anyone who is properly in occupancy at the property from the date of application all the way through closing that benefits from the right to return. So the next question is, please explain extension of RAD rights for non-RAD tax credit units in mixed finance properties undergoing RAD conversion and syndication. So I think that this question is geared towards a property that under public housing has some public housing units and some non-public housing units at the property. The public housing rules have this concept of mixed finance where the property has a mix of public housing and non-public housing units. So the in that context, the RAD residents are let's say it's 30 out of the 100 units. The RAD residents are those residents of those 30 households. The RAD rights apply to those 30 households, although I would strongly suggest that the residents of all the other units would benefit from being invited to the resident meetings, getting the resident notices, all of the rest of their rights. But RAD has not extended the resident rights associated with RAD units across the property as a whole. That's a little different from what Tai was describing about RAD rights being extended to both RAD units and non-RAD PBB units at a property. What we're talking about when we talk about the non-RAD PBB units is that in the course of a conversion of a property under RAD, sometimes the public housing units are converted to a project-based voucher subsidy stream under a different regulation, a different HUD structure related to, it's called Section 18, demolition disposition, or something like that. There are a couple different mechanisms for that. And what we're really trying to say is that if it was a public housing unit before, and it's part of a property going through RAD, all of the formerly public housing residents are treated the same, whether or not their specific unit is converted under RAD or whether their neighbor's unit was converted under RAD, but their specific unit was converted under one of these other tools. So we're really trying to ensure that the RAD protections apply to all of the households that were covered by the public housing rules at a particular site. And so going back to the original question about mixed finance properties, the RAD protections apply to the households who were public housing households under the mixed finance structure. So why don't we take a question from Lauren Song, who has raised her hand. Lauren, your phone is now unmuted. Do you want to ask your question?
Sure. I wanted to know, in the case where there is a Section 18 RAD blend project, whether the described right to return attaches at the time period that you had described earlier, which is basically at the time of the application, the Section 18 application, as opposed to when the RCC or CHAP issues.
So that's a good question. I'm going to translate the question a little bit for folks who may not be familiar with the phrase RAD Section 18 blend. A few moments ago, I was talking about how sometimes a public housing unit converts to Section 8 to a project-based voucher under a regulation that is different from RAD. That is often under what's called Section 18. And RAD has a provision that certain types of projects, if they are meeting certain criteria, can convert 75% of the units under RAD and 25% of the units under Section 18, and that's what we refer to as the RAD Section 18 blend. So in that case, in that scenario, you'd have, let's say you have 100 units at your property, you would have 75 formerly public housing households who are under RAD and 25 formerly public households who are under Section 18. and converting, all of them converting to, let's say, project-based vouchers. The RAD Section 18 blend is initiated the same way a RAD conversion is, and then we handle the coordination with the Section 18 processing. So I would think that the RAD protections apply to all of those public housing households from the date that the RAD application was submitted. This is something that I'm not sure that the RAD notice says explicitly, and we will probably want to put an FAQ out there to confirm that. But that would be my interpretation of how the rules work. So the next written question is, LIHTC has a similar requirement to Section 8 to establish subsidy standards, or LIHTC follows the subsidy standards established by the Housing Authority. Not sure, let me think for a moment to understand the question. So certainly, low-income housing tax credit units have requirements about what the rent is and how much the tenant pays in rent. But low-income housing tax credit units don't have a rental assistance subsidy directly. It's just a calculation of the rent. So the Section 8 is paying is subsidizing the rent based on the resident's income at 30% of the resident's income. So in a property that has, where a unit is both low-income housing tax credit and Section 8, it is typically the Section 8 rule that is determining how much the tenant is paying for the rent, and HUD is making up the difference to the payment standard. So the next written question we have is, does the right of return persist if the tenant has to leave their unit for 12 plus months due to the construction period? So, great question. You may have noticed that Tai said that if a resident is out of the property for more than 12 months, they are considered permanently displaced for URA purposes, and that's an important thing. They're considered permanently displaced for purposes of the Uniform Relocation Act, which makes them eligible for additional relocation protections and payments. That distinction of for URA purposes versus for RAD purposes is important, because for RAD, if they are temporarily relocated, they are entitled to the right to return and are still temporarily relocated from the RAD perspective, even if the construction is 14 months or 16 months or whatever it is. From the RAD perspective, the household keeps that right of return until the RAD process allows them to move back in. The household can choose to move and stay where they are and take some of the uniform relocation benefits after the 12 months has passed, if where they're staying is a place that can accommodate them long term. But the relocation, there are sort of two sets of relocation and resident rights. One is the Uniform Relocation Act, the other is RAD, and under RAD, the 12 months is not an important distinction. So the right to return definitely does persist, even if the resident leaves the unit for more than 12 months due to the RAD construction. So the next question, written question, is for non-RAD PBVs in a Section 18 RAD disposition project, can families move into an overhoused unit if an appropriately sized PBV unit is not available? So this is a question that relates to the what size unit a household should be living in when they are receiving rental assistance under public housing or Section 8 or whatever. The base concept of all of the subsidy programs is that a household should not be living, a family should not be living in a house that is, or an apartment that is bigger than what they need. So a single person shouldn't be living in a 4-bedroom house because there's probably a family that needs 4 bedrooms. That's the basic concept of whether you're overhoused or not. And there are often situations where two parents are raising a family and they have a 4-bedroom unit because of the number of kids they have at home. And then over time, the kids move out on their own and you have 2 individuals living still in the 4-bedroom unit. The rules of all of the programs, Section 8 public housing, are that when an appropriate size unit is available, that household is supposed to move into the appropriate sized unit. So that single couple might move into a 1-bedroom unit. If there is no 1-bedroom unit at the property, they may stay there in a unit that's too large for a fair amount of time, but they are supposed to move to the next appropriately sized unit. So in RAD, the right of return is that you can move back to the property, but if you do need to move to a smaller unit because you were overhoused, that can happen in the course of the RAD project. It's not the same, there's not a promise of the exact same unit. It's the promise of rental assistance at the property. So for a non-RAD PBV, they would be subject to the same right of return and ability to continue living at the property. So if the only available unit is to stay in an overhoused unit, they would be able to stay in an overhoused unit. But if there is an appropriately sized unit available, they would need to move to that. So the precise answer to this question was, can families move into an overhoused unit if an appropriately sized unit is not available? The answer would be yes. Long way of saying yes. Sorry. The next question, and I'm doing more of the written questions than the raised hands just because there are more of the written questions coming in, so I'm trying to sort of be a little fair back and forth. The next question is related to choice mobility, and someone is asking whether a PHA can come up with a plan to alternate available voucher authority between RAS residents and people on the waiting list. There are rules in the RAD notice that allow a housing authority to reserve some of the turnover units for both categories, folks who are coming up on the regular waiting list and folks who are coming up through RAD Choice Mobility. I would need to refresh my memory before being able to rattle the rule off, but it's definitely in the RAD notice, and there is a way to parse, to separate the two and keep both lists going. So I'd suggest that the person asking the question check the RAD notice, and if you can't find it, feel free to send an email to rad@hud.gov. The next question is, does URA apply to all RAD conversion projects or only to projects with triggering funding, such as the home or the CDBG program. So the person asking the question is right, that the URA typically is applied based on the type of money that is used in the project. There's triggering funding that if certain types of money are used, it triggers the URA, and there are certain types of activities that trigger the URA. However, in the RAD notice, we have specified that all RAD transactions are subject to the URA. So all RAD activities are covered by the Uniform Relocation Act. The next question is, when a new admission becomes zero HAP, what is the rent charged to the tenant? TTP, contract rent, or market rent, or LIHTC max rent? So this question has to do with when a new household moves into the property and they are what's called a, quote, zero HAP, end quote, household. That means that 30% of their income is higher than the rent payment standard on the Section 8 HAP contract. So in revision 4, there is a feature here that is relevant to PBV. In the standard PBV rules, a household cannot move in unless they are receiving at least $1 on the HAP contract. So in a standard PBV property, a zero HAP household would not be able to move into the property. Revision 4 has, and that has been the case in RAD PBV properties as well. In Revision 4 of the RAD notice, which was just published last month, there's a discussion about how a housing authority may request a waiver of that rule if the property or the community fits certain requirements. Those requirements are described in Revision 4. So the Revision 4 is a little bit of a roadmap on how to request that waiver and what you should be presenting to the Office of Public and Indian Housing in order to get that waiver to allow a zero HAP household to move into the unit. On the PBRA side, there is not that requirement about the zero HAP. So a household that is a zero HAP household can move in. They would continue to pay 30% of their income as rent. So the next question is, when residents are recertified 1 year after the last recertification, sorry, let me read this again. When are residents recertified? 1 year after the last recertification, 1 year after the RAD conversion, or some other point in time? That is a good question. I think it's, yes, so it's 1 year after the last recertification. The next question is, are all of the resident rights extended to non-RAD PBV residents only in the 75-25 RAD combo blend sites, or would they be extended to all non-RAD PBV residents in any site that has RAD units? So this question, another scenario where there are non-RAD PBV sites is one where, let's say there were 100 units and 5 units were reduced by under the de minimis reduction, and you have 95 RAD units and 5 non-RAD units, and the local housing authority, through their own voucher program, extends decides to project base vouchers on those 5 units. Those would be considered non-RAD PBV units. So there are scenarios where the non-RAD PBV protections apply beyond the 75-25 combo blend. So we are at 3 o'clock. Do we ever run webinars late?
We can do a couple more questions.
Why don't we do 2 more questions, because I've been a little verbose in my answers. So we're going to do 2 more questions, and then we will record all of the written questions that have been, and we will we'll provide written answers to them. So the next question is, what happens to tenant participation funds that have been issued to resident councils once a RAD conversion takes place? Do those funds return to the PHA since the councils are officially disbanded and have to reestablish? I don't know that we've actually written anything into the RAD notice on that score, but I would suspect that once the funds have been issued to the resident council should continue to be able to use those funds. So we will check that and provide a written answer in addition, but that is my suspicion. So the next question, I'm not going to do 2 more actually. So one question is, so even if Section 18 regs say the Uniform Relocation does not apply, does the Uniform Relocation Act apply? The Uniform Relocation Act applies for all RAD conversions, so that would apply across the board in a RAD in a property that is going through RAD. And the last question. If a PHA has a policy to rescreen residents for criminal backgrounds during each annual recertification, is this rescreening restricted during the RAD conversion? That's a very good question. So I'm going to assume in this, assume for a moment that this annual rescreening for criminal backgrounds has applied to their Section 8 program on a long-standing basis. And I believe if that is the case, then it would probably be applicable on an ongoing basis because it's not specific to RAD and it's not being introduced as part of RAD. But I'm on thin ice on this answer. But let me supplement the answer with what I know I am not on thin ice about, which is that the Housing Authority cannot introduce a criminal background check to happen on the annual rescreenings after a RAD conversion as a way to get around the fact that they weren't allowed to rescreen for criminal background at the moment of the RAD conversion. So the key issue is that there's a distinction between what is happening on initial occupancy and what is happening for ongoing continued occupancy in a unit. And the prohibition on rescreening is that even though when a RAD conversion happens, there is a new Section 8 contract and residents are technically a new admission to a Section 8 property at that point. The prohibition on rescreening is saying, in real practical, when you're looking at the situation on the ground, this is not a resident who is coming from the outside into the property for the first time. This is a resident that has fundamentally been in occupancy and is continuing in occupancy, even though the form of the lease is changing. And so there is no rescreening just because it's a technical new occupancy. The prohibition on rescreening is really focusing on, let's move past the technicalities and look at the reality of the situation. Is this someone moving in for the first time, or is this someone who's just continuing to live where they have previously lived? So the prohibition on rescreening is designed to ensure that the household is treated the way they would be treated if they're just continuing to live where they have previously lived, and is not focused on the technicality of this being a new Section 8 contract. So that's why I suspect that if they had annual recertifications that are standard for all of their voucher administration, those would continue to apply. So I know there were lots more questions that we didn't get a chance to answer. Really appreciate everybody getting on the line today. Really appreciate all the very good questions. We will, as I've said a couple times, we will respond to the questions after the webinar. The webinar will be, has been recorded, unless there was a technical glitch, but we don't think so. The webinar has been recorded. We will post the webinar on the RAD resource desk. The slides will also be on the RAD resource desk. If you want the slides right away, you can download them. They are identified as handouts on the webinar platform. And if you have additional questions that you forgot to ask, you should email them to rad@hud.gov. And Tayi has one final announcement.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to add, thank you so much, Tom. I just wanted to add that for anyone who's not aware, we have a great website, hud.gov/rad, and there's actually a tab that says resident information. And if you click on that, there's another tab that says how does RAD impact me? And it includes several very helpful resident fact sheets. So please take a look at those if you haven't yet.
Great. That's a very good reminder, Tayi. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for getting on the line, and have a good rest of your afternoon.